You're welcome. Now, everyone, I turn you over to Ms. John Van Houten.
Spend those dollars wisely.
Don't worry, we got plenty more trivia to come later.
Welcome and hello to all of you. What a big crowd. My name is Joan Van Houten, and I'm a member of the board of the Historical Society of Long Beach, and I welcome you all to this wonderful event. The story that you're going to be hearing today is a very dramatic and very pivotal one, and a story of education at Poly High School. In fact, as you can see, it is called Saving Poly. Vanessa Rose Parker and Will Proctor are real veterans of several cemetery tours and are going to do a magnificent job of portraying Liz and Don Wallace. I promise. I'm also honored to introduce Bonnie Lowenthal, who represents the 70 Assembly District for our community. And of course, that includes a very large port complex and a very diverse community. Bonnie is also a volunteer in the city of Long Beach, as you can see today, as she is in costume. Her political career began after decades of volunteer work. She, as you all know, served 2 terms on the USD School Board and 2 terms in the Long Beach City Council. And now my privilege to present Liz and Don Wallace.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Liz Wallace, and I think I should start by telling you something very important about my family.
Our family.
Our family. I graduated from Poly.
Woo, go Jackrabbit!
My sons, Don and Alex, and my daughters,
Our
daughters, Nancy and Ann, also graduated from Poly.
Well, let that go by just a little bit. Can you all still hear me? Okay. So my grandfather Wallace, and he's over. I don't know if you can see over here. There's the Suburban. Behind that, there's
Red flowers in the distance.
Red flowers in the distance behind the Suburban. That's my grandfather Wallace. Now, he graduated from Long Beach High School, and that's the predecessor to Long Beach Polytechnic High School. Now, nobody called it anything but Poly. Now, if you're an athlete and you lettered in a sport at Millikan, you get an M. And if you're an athlete and you letter in a sport at Wilson, you get a W. But if you're an athlete and you letter in a sport at Poly, you don't get a P, you get an L for Long Beach Polytechnic High School. So as you can see, all of our families had been successful, all members of our family had been successful Poly grads for generations.
And we were determined, when Poly was threatened, to preserve it. It just had a great sense of community and had a pride in Long Beach. It was a wonderful school with marvelous teachers. It was a really inspiring place to be. So whether it was challenged by a team in a crosstown game,
I can't think of a crosstown team that's a real threat.
or whether it was threatened by issues of educational inequality, the Poly community really rose to the challenge. Now, before the 1960s, Poly was the only integrated high school in Long Beach. The students lived in segregated neighborhoods, but they came together to study at Poly. The school sat along on the edge of what had become the black neighborhood in Long Beach. It was California Avenue, which then became Martin Luther King.
Now that's the street that runs behind Poly.
And nearby there were nice but modest homes, mostly owned by people who had come here from Iowa or Kansas or other states. Some had come here from Mexico, and others were Japanese Americans who had come back after the World War II relocation.
Poly's attendance area also included the neighborhoods of Bixby Knolls and our area around Virginia Country Club. These were neighborhoods of mostly affluent whites. Some were professionals like doctors and attorneys.
Like my husband.
Thank you, dear. And some came from old money. But in all of these neighborhoods were families who lived there for generations. Like us, the Wallaces, children followed their parents and grandparents to Poly. As you can see, Poly students came from every racial background and economic background.
But while they spent their days at school together, they still went home to their mostly segregated neighborhoods.
Well, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement began to change as people began to challenge separate but equal policies. Now, even if we didn't see it in person, we all saw it on the news or in newspapers and magazines, images of African Americans being attacked for sitting at white-only lunch counters or in white-only areas of bus waiting lounges and so on. Now, it's important you understand Long Beach was never legally segregated.
But it was.
Well, by traditions and expectations. Now, after World War II, new subdivisions were being built on the east side, like Los Altos.
And Lakewood.
But it was clear these new neighborhoods were being built just for white families. African Americans who'd served their country, defended their country, and were returning home from the war were essentially being told to return to the same crowded neighborhoods in which they'd always lived.
They were still expected to live how and where they always had. I guess the American dream had neighborhood boundaries.
Well, fortunately, California leaders recognized these injustices, and they passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act to make housing discrimination illegal. But, of course, realtors and property owners weren't happy with this, so they mounted a campaign to nullify the Rumford Fair Housing Act with Proposition 14, and that passed with voter approval in 1964.
The next year, the tensions had risen so high between the African American community and the LAPD that riots broke out in Watts. Now, the National Guard troops came in and they stopped the violence, and they even patrolled the streets here in Long Beach just to stave off the trouble. But I mean, just all of it, the Watts riots, the TV coverage of what was going on in the South, it all just made us sit and black and white alike and think about our own lives.
Well, and think about things like Poly's campus that in 1965 hadn't been upgraded since the 33 quake knocked most of it down and it had to be rebuilt. Compare that to the bright new East Side campuses.
And at this point, the US and the Soviet Union had been vying to be the first in space. And once Russia launched Sputnik, America vowed to not just catch up, but to surpass that technology. And while the science buildings and labs at Millikan and Lakewood reflected that national passion for science education, Millikan was even named for a physicist. Compare that to the science buildings and labs at Poly that hadn't been updated since the 1930s.
Well, in this emotional atmosphere of the time, students began to challenge school administrators about such things. Now, some black students thought that white people were to blame.
And some white people blamed the blacks for just complaining about the injustice.
But we knew that the real issue was educational equality. We'd heard Dr. Martin Luther King talk about his dream of racial equality. And we began to wonder, was the education of our students at Poly truly equal to the education of students at Millikan and Lakewood?
In other words, Brown versus the Board of Education had come to Poly. Now, some of the black students had seen the way that lives were changing in the South for the African Americans, but they wanted to see immediate changes on their own campuses as well. Now, I was a relative novice on the school board at that point. I think I had been elected 2 years prior, but I was very aware of all of the problems. Poly just wasn't taking care of itself. It was dirty, it was poorly equipped, the library was falling apart. I remember the chemistry building was a disaster. It was dangerous. But the spirit was still there. There was still a great Poly spirit. So we decided that we were not going to let this happen. We are not going to let this school close. And then a wonderful thing happened. My husband, who I consider very astute, said this.
You've got to get the parents together, sit them down in a quiet room, and talk things out.
So that's what we did. We got parents from all across Poly together with members of the African American community like Bill Barnes and Mary Butler, along with parents of white students and school leaders, just a lot of people. And we all just decided that we weren't going to let this school close.
Now, Liz would come home from a school board meeting and she'd fix something extremely basic like macaroni and cheese or spaghetti. And
Why are you making it sound like I starved you?
oh, you know I love you.
Anyways, we had a rumpus room in the back that didn't have a telephone. So we got everyone together and we sat them down. I fed them so that they were captive. I mean, there was nowhere for them to go.
That was my point.
And we just talked and talked and talked.
And talked. And talked.
Yes, but that's how the Poly Interracial Committee was started. And I really consider this one of the great achievements of the Long Beach School District. I'm not taking credit, I am giving credit to all of the people who worked so hard and fought to keep it open.
But the problems that started, that had brought us together, they continued at the school.
The agitation, fistfights, police coming to campus.
And there was one Friday when things got really bad. Students over at Long Beach State, they were a little more urgent about change. They came to campus and they encouraged the black students to become more militant. Campus administrators got a little nervous and they called the police. And several students ended up in the emergency room over in St. Mary's. Now, most of them just had some scrapes and bruises, but a few needed some stitches. The parents who had been clamoring for Poly to be closed saw this as proof that they were right and vowed not to send their kids back.
There were others, I'm sure, who had been worried before this, but they just hadn't been very vocal about it. But even they kept their kids back just until they were sure that all of this was stopped. That Monday, the teachers came back to teach, but there were almost no students.
Well, our daughter Ann, though, I mean, she and 3 of her friends, they refused to stay home. So we drove them to school. We watched as they held hands and they walked onto campus. The teachers were there, but they were the only students. But they stayed. And the teachers taught. They felt they had to be the example, you know? Well, the next day, more students came, and more, and more. I was just so proud of Ann. It just...
There were other students, however, mostly white, that just disappeared.
You know, their parents either rented apartments on the other side of town, or they simply lied about their addresses so their kids could attend other schools and escape Poly.
This was a really emotional time for me. It was very difficult. I lost a lot of friends. I wouldn't support their motions when they came before the board. I couldn't do it. It was a very difficult time. There are people that refused to ever speak to me again.
Well, eventually things worked out. I mean, the program we started was expanded, and the library and science buildings at Poly were improved, and you know the community came up with a plan to integrate all of the schools in the district without forced busing. They came up with magnet programs such as PACE at Poly, and they allowed parents and students choose the schools they'd attend.
And thanks to the hard work of the Poly Interracial Committee, the school leaders supported this.
Well, and Poly's athletic teams kept winning championships. Now, that really helped boost pride. Now, my son Don, our son, wrote a book about one of Poly's championship football teams. It's called One Great Game.
Little family plug, you can pick it up on Amazon.
Now, I'm sure the administrators thought that things were going to calm down and that they'd heard the last of the Wallaces.
But they would be wrong. In 1970, our daughters, and Nancy, and 4 of their friends formed the Girls Golf Liberation, which kicked off a challenge to the CIF that was against the rule that girls could not play on boys' high school sports teams.
Well, you see, there was no girls' golf team at Poly. So the girls enlisted their attorney fathers, like me,
Very helpful.
to sue the CIF.
And theirs was one of the cases that helped create Title IX in 1972, which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act, which, among other things, stated that you had to have equal resources spent on girls' and boys' athletic teams. And then, oh, I lost my hat.
You're falling apart.
I am falling all over the place. I'm gonna have to come back next year to tell you about that story. I'm losing myself here. But we have someone who's a special visitor that would like to share a little story with you. So we're gonna let her come on up. Thank you, Liz. You're very welcome. Very nice.
My name is Mary Pearce Dolley. I'm actually a neighbor of theirs, buried right over there. And I come from a very proud Holly family. But what I want to tell you about is someone they mentioned earlier, Mary Dell Butler. Someone very important in the Long Beach schools. Mary and her twin sister were born in 1924 in Texas. Their mother died shortly after they were born, and their father remarried, but they were raised there, of course, in a segregated school. Some years later, they moved to Long Beach because they heard that there were many more opportunities for African Americans in Long Beach. So they came here. Mary's sister got married to a handsome sailor and moved out of town. Luckily for us, Mary met her husband, Richard, and they had 8 children. They stayed in Long Beach. They settled here. Richard worked for the city of Long Beach doing street maintenance, and Mary herself worked at St. Mary's. But as they raised their 8 children, Mary became very active in the Long Beach schools. So much so that at Whittier School, she became the PTA president. Now, what was unusual about that? She was the first African American to be a PTA president. And as their children moved on, they went to Franklin Junior High and then to Poly High School. And wouldn't you know that Mary became the president of the PTA at Poly High School. So as she became better known in Long Beach, along with the Wallace family, she was appointed to the Long Beach Recreation Commission because she cared so much about youth and their activities. And then she was appointed to the Personnel Commission at the Long Beach Unified School District. But in 1993, a school was named after her, the Mary Dell Butler School down here on 20th Street in Long Beach. And not quite the end of this story. In 1994, she was one of the early supporters of Bonnie Lowenthal for school board. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Well, today you've heard a few stories about the Wallaces and our friends here in town.
If you're lucky and you come back next year, maybe we'll share something else, maybe like the Girls Golf Liberation Movement.
Exactly. And we actually are fortunate enough to have some of the actual Wallace family members here today, sons and grandson and granddaughter. Thank you all for coming out to support the Historical Society of Long Beach.
Go Poly!
Go Poly! Have a great day. Thank you.